The progress of the case law throughout history must be cautious. The decision is not between stability or change. It is a question of speed of change. The decision is not between rigidity or flexibility. It is a question of the degree of flexibility. The judge must take into account a complex array of considerations. A judge must consider the coherence of the system in which he or she operates, the powers and limitations of the judiciary as an institution, as defined within the system, and the way in which his or her role is perceived. The second role of a judge in a democracy is to protect the Constitution and democracy itself. Indeed, if we wish to preserve democracy, we cannot take its existence for granted. We must fight for it. This is certainly the case for new democracies, but it is also true of old and well-established ones. The assumption that it cannot happen to us can no longer be accepted. Anything can happen. If democracy was perverted and destroyed in Germany of Kant, Beethoven, and Goethe, it can happen anywhere. If we do not protect democracy, democracy will not protect us. I don't know whether the judges in Germany could have prevented Hitler from coming to power in the 30s. But I do know that the lesson of the Holocaust and the Second World War is the need to enact democratic constitutions and ensure that they are put into effect by judges whose main task is to protect democracy. It was this awareness that in the post-World War II era helped promote the idea of judicial review of legislative action and made human rights central. It led to the recognition of defensive democracy and even militant democracy. And it shaped my belief that the main role of a judge in a democracy is to maintain and protect the Constitution and democracy. Democracy is a rich and complex normative concept. It rests on two bases. The first is the sovereignty of the people. This sovereignty is exercised in free elections held on a regular basis in which the people choose their representatives, who in turn represent their views. This aspect of democracy is manifested in majority rule and in the centrality of the legislative body through which the people representative act. This is the formal aspect of democracy. The second aspect of democracy is reflected in the rule of values, other than the value of majority rule, which characterizes democracy. The most important of these are separation of powers, the rule of law, judicial independence, human rights, and basic principles which reflect yet other values such as morality, justice, public peace, security, reasonableness, proportionality, good faith. This aspect of democracy is the rule of democratic values. It is a substantive aspect of democracy. The world of democracy is rich. Democracy should not be viewed from one-dimensional vantage point. Democracy is a multidimensional. It is based both on the power of the majority and on the rights of the individual. Indeed, democracy is based on a very individual's enjoyment of rights of which even the majority cannot deny him, simply because the power of the majority is in its hands. Democracy has its own internal morality, without which the regime is no longer a democratic one. Democracy, then, is based on simultaneous existence, both of the rule of majority and the rule of values, which characterizes democracy. A delicate balance must be kept between the two aspects of democracy in a way that protects the nucleus of each of those aspects. This balance will be based inherently upon the restriction placed both on a majority rule and on the rule of fundamental values of democracy. The realization of those two roles by the judge requires that judges will act objectively. The objectivity required of a judge is difficult to attain. Even when we look at ourselves from the outside, we do so with our own eyes. Nevertheless, my judicial experience tells me that objectivity is possible. A judge does not operate in a vacuum. A judge is part of society, and society influences the judge. The judge is influenced by the intellectual movements and the legal thinking that prevail. A judge is always part of the people. It may be true that the judge sometimes sits in an ivory tower, though my ivory tower is located in the hills of Jerusalem and not on Mount Olympus in Greece. The judge progresses with the history of the people. All of these elements contribute to the judge's objective perspective. When judges give expression to the fundamental values of the system, they give expression to the values that, in their eyes, seem proper and basic. Some subjectification of this process is inevitable. Complete objectivity is unattainable. The personal aspect of the judge is always present, and his or her life experience neither disappears nor can disappear. Rosie, you were right. We would not want it to, because in this situation, it is the judge personality that finds expression, the same personality that underwent and passed the judicial nomination process. We need not, however, go from extreme to extreme. Rejecting complete objectivity does not require us to embrace complete subjectivity. There is a third way, reflected in acknowledging the importance of the centrality of judicial objectivity, while recognizing unreservedly that it can never fully be achieved. It is enough for a judge to make an honest attempt to objectify his or her exercise of discretion, recognizing that it cannot be done in every case. As a rule, I have always tried to carry out my role as a judge within the framework of social consensus to the extent that data exists about it. The judge should generally not be a crusader of a new social consensus. As a rule, judges should reflect values and principles that exist in their system rather than create them. Nevertheless, there are cases, and they must naturally be few, in which the judge carries out his role properly by ignoring the prevailing social consensus and becoming the flag bearer of a new social consensus. Consider Brown versus Board of Education, which was just mentioned. I don't know what the consensus was in the United States just before the Supreme Court decision in Brown, but the court at that time fulfilled its role even if it ruled against the then prevailing consensus. Naturally, a court will not retain public confidence if it announces a new Brown twice a week. Similarly, a court will lose public confidence if it misses an opportunity like Brown when it is faced with it. In the final analysis, everything is a question of degree. The consensus with which judges usually ought to operate should be a consensus grounded in the fundamental values of the legal system. Judges should not act according to the consensus formed by transient trends that are inconsistent with the society's fundamental values. Judges' social framework must be central and basic, not temporary and fleeting. When society is not being true to itself, judges are not required to give expression to its passing trends. They must stand firm against these trends while giving expression to the social consensus that reflects their society's fundamental principles and tenets. An essential condition for realizing the judicial role is public confidence in the judge. This means confidence in judicial independence, fairness, and impartiality. It means public confidence in the ethical standard of the judge. It means public confidence that judges are not interested parties to the legal struggle and that they are not fighting for their own power, but to protect the Constitution and democracy. It means public confidence that the judge does not express his or her personal views, but rather the fundamental beliefs of the nation. Indeed, the judge has neither sword nor purse. All he or she has is the public confidence in them. This fact means that the public recognizes the legitimacy of the judicial decision, even if it disagrees with its contents. The precondition of public confidence runs the risk of being misunderstood. The need to ensure public confidence does not mean the need to ensure popularity. Public confidence does not mean following popular trends or public opinion polls. Public confidence does not mean accountability to the public in the way that the executive and the legislative branch are accountable. Public confidence does not mean pleasing the public. Public confidence does not mean ruling contrary to the law or contrary to the judge's conscience to bring about a result that the public desires. On the contrary, public confidence means ruling according to the law and according to the judge's conscience, whether the attitude of the public may be. Public confidence means giving expression to history, not to hysteria. Public confidence is ensured by the recognition that the judge is not doing justice that the judge is doing justice within the framework of law. Judges must act inside and outside the court in a manner that preserves public confidence in them. They must understand that judging is not merely a job, but a way of life. It is a way of life that does not include the pursuit of material wealth or publicity. It is a way of life based on spiritual wealth. It is a way of life that includes an objective and impartial search for the truth. It is not fiat but reason, not mastery but modesty, not strength but compassion, not richness but reputation, not an attempt to please everyone, but a firm insistence on values and principles, not surrender to or compromise with interest groups, but insisting on upholding the law, not making decisions according to temporary whims, but progressing consistently on the basis of deeply held belief and fundamental values. Admittedly, judging is a way of life that involves some degree of seclusion, abstaining from social and political struggle, restrictions on the freedom of expression and the freedom of response, and a large amount of isolation and internalization. But judging is emphatically not a way of life that involves a withdrawal from society. There should be no wall between the judge and the society in which he judges. The judge is part of the people. What are the means a judge can use in order to fulfill his or her role? What are their tools? Of course, the means of realizing judicial role must be legitimate. The principle of the rule of law applies first and foremost to the judges themselves, who do not share the legislative freedom of creating new tools. The bricks which we build our structures are limited. Our power to realize our role depends on our ability to design new structures with the same old bricks, or to create, sometimes, new bricks. Sometimes we succeed in creating new tools. Here the genius of the law is evident. But such inventions are few. Usually we return to the old tools and use them to resolve new situations. Here are some examples. Our main tool is, of course, interpretation. Rules of interpretation are judge-made rules. We should shape our rules of interpretation in such a way that will allow us to fulfill our role. Indeed, the bridging of the gap between law and life and the protection of the Constitution and democracy is not just the outcome of an interpretive theory. It is the underlying goal of interpretation itself. We judges should shape our interpretation rules so as to achieve the twofold goals imposed on us. Judges are creators of the common law. In developing the common law, judges should bridge the gap between law and life and protect the Constitution and its values. This is the theory of the common law in a nutshell. It is how it is integrated in law as primary limb of the body politic. The common law, like judicial interpretation, is a primary tool in the realization of judicial role. It is a very important tool. Its potential to change and rejuvenate facilitates the law's adoption to the changing social needs. Its characteristic sensitivity to fundamental values and fundamental perspective guarantees appropriate protection for the Constitution and its values. A very important tool for a judge to realize his or her role is balancing and weighing. Balancing and weighing themselves metaphors reflect the need to decide a conflict between values and principles that are accepted in the legal system. The concept of balancing recognizes that the fundamental principles may conflict with one another, and that the proper resolution of this conflict lies not in the elimination of the inferior value, but in determining the proper boundary between the conflicting values. Similarly, the concept of balance reflects the recognition that fundamental principles have weight, and that it is possible to classify them according to their relative social importance. The act of weighing is merely a normative act designed to give the principles their proper place in law. Another tool that judges use to fulfill their role in a democracy is determining justiciability. That is, judges identify those issues about which they ought not to make a decision, leaving that decision to other branches of the state. The more non-justiciability is expended, the less opportunity judges have for bridging law and society and for protecting the Constitution and democracy. Given these consequences, I regarded the doctrine of non-justiciability or political question with considerable awareness. I prefer to examine an argument on its merits. In many cases, where some of my colleagues have dismissed claims on the ground of non-justiciability, I dismissed them on the ground that the disputed action was legal and therefore that the claim should be dismissed on the merits because of lack of cause of action. The court should not abdicate its role in a democracy merely because it is uncomfortable or fears tension with other branches of the state. These tensions not only fail to justify dismissing the claim, but is even desirable on occasion. It is because of this tension that the freedom of the individual is guaranteed. Lastly, an important tool judges use in order to fulfill their role in a democracy is shaping the rules of standing. These are the rules by which the judge decides who can apply to the court in a public law complaint. The issue of standing appears to many to be marginal in public law. This is certainly the case if one adopts a view that the only person who can bring an action is someone who was right or was injured. But if we liberalize the test for standing, we will usher in a new era of judicial decision-making, whose ramifications are far greater than the issue of standing itself. This is the case because liberal rules of standing enable the court to hear matters that ordinarily would not find their way before the court. How a judge applies the rule of standing is a litmus test for determining his or her approach to the judicial role. A judge who regards his judicial role as bridging the gap between law and society and protecting democracy will tend to expand the rules of standing. It follows that I favor expanding the rules of standing and releasing them from the requirement of any injury in fact. And I must say the Supreme Court of Israel adopted this approach. Terrorism creates much tension between the essential components of democracy. One pillar of democracy, the rule of the people through its elected representative, may encourage taking all steps effective in fighting terrorism, even if they are harmful to human rights. The other pillar of democracy may encourage protection of rights of every individual, including the terrorist, even at cost of undermining the fight against terrorism. We, judges in modern democracies, are responsible for protecting democracy, both from the terrorism and from the means the state wants to use to fight terrorism. Of course, matters of daily life constantly test judges' ability to protect democracy, but judges meet their supreme test in situations of terror. The protection of every individual's human right is much more fundamental duty in times of terrorism than in times of peace and security. If we fail in our role in times of terrorism, we will be unable to fulfill our role in time of peace and security. In my last case, dealing with terror, I wrote, I would like to make quite a lengthy citation because it tells not only my views, but I hope the law in Israel by now. The basic law, it's our constitution, do not recognize two sets of laws, one that applies in time of peace and the other that applies in time of war. Indeed, the Israeli constitutional law has a consistent approach to human rights in periods of relative calm and in periods of increased fighting. We do not recognize a clear distinction between the two. We do not have a balancing formula that are unique to times of war. Naturally, human rights are not absolute. They can be restricted in times of peace and in times of war. I do not have a right to shout fire in a theater full of spectators. War is like a barrel full of explosives next to the source of fire. In times of war, the likelihood that damage will occur to the public interest increases, and the strength of the harm to the public interest increases. And so the restrictions of the right becomes possible within the framework of the existing criteria. Indeed, we do not have two sets of laws or balances, one for peaceful time and the other for time of terror. There's no possibility of making a clear distinction between the status of human rights in times of war and the status in times of peace. The dividing line between war and peace is a fine one. This is the case everywhere. It is certainly the case in Israel. There's no possibility of maintaining it over time. We must treat human rights seriously, both in times of war and in times of peace. We must free ourselves from the naive belief that when terror ends, we will be able to put the clock back. Indeed, if we fail in our task in times of war and terror, we will not be able to carry out our task properly in times of peace and calm. Thus, we see that there is only one track within which framework the petitions before us should be examined. This track is, with regard to any claim against the constitutionality of a statute, the track of the basic laws. Within the framework of this track, we should follow the well-trodden path of examining the constitutionality of the law. There is no parallel track. There is no alternative route. There is one path that applies at all times. It applies in times of peace. It applies in time of war. The end of citation. Democracy ensures us, as judges, independence. It strengthens us against the fluctuations of public opinion. The real test of this independence comes in situations of terror. Precisely in these times, we judges must hold fast to fundamental principles and values. We must embrace our supreme responsibility to protect democracy and the Constitution. Admittedly, the struggle against terrorism turns our democracy into a defensive democracy. or a militant democracy. Nonetheless, this defense and this fight must not deprive our regime of its democratic character. Defensive democracy, yes. Uncontrolled democracy, no. The judge in a modern democracy must act in this spirit. I tried to summarize some, very shortly I think, aspects of my judicial philosophy as to the role of a judge in a democracy. I do realize that such a philosophy has its critics. It may and does sharpen the natural tensions between the judiciary and the other two branches of government. It may affect the confidence of the public in the judiciary. It may be labeled as activist in some aspects. It clearly has its disadvantages. It may not fit some democracies. It may not fit us in years to come. I do, however, believe that it is the proper judicial philosophy for our democracy in our times. One should not forget that a large part of Israeli population immigrated to Israel from the Near East or Eastern Europe, places where there are no democratic traditions. Democracy is just young in Israel. Because of English influences, many view democracy in formal terms. Parliament for them is omnipotence. Further, for a variety of reasons, the concept of "it is not done" is not a central part of governing in Israel. Israel lacks a rigid constitutional framework. Basic structures and concepts can be changed by a bare majority. The protection of those structures and the concepts needs judges who see their role as protectors of our constitution and democracy. Human rights in Israel was until 1992 largely the creation of the courts. Since 1992, they are embodied in two basic laws. The Supreme Court interpreted those basic laws to mean that the courts have review power of constitutionality of those laws. The Parliament and the executive branch are following this decision. In order to properly fulfill such power, one needs a judicial philosophy that views the protection of human rights as a major role for judges. Such philosophy is especially important when a country is under security risks. The political non-accountability of Israeli judges make us fit to protect human rights against excessive demands of security. Israel is a militant democracy. In order to be militant and still democracy, Israel needs judges that do believe that the protection of Israel's democracy is their main task. Does all this affect confidence of the public in judges? I don't know. I do believe that at this stage of our national development, we need judges with strong commitment to democracy and its protection. In better times, things may and probably will change. I regard myself as a judge who is sensitive to his role in a democracy. I take seriously the task imposed upon me in the past, of course, bridging the gap between law and society and protecting the constitution and democracy. Despite frequent criticism and if frequent descended to personal attacks and threats of violence, I have continued on this path in the 28 years I was on the court. I hope that by doing so, I have served my legal system properly. Indeed, as judges in our country's highest courts, we must continue on our path according to our conscience. A heavy responsibility rests on our shoulders. But even in hard times, we must remain true to ourselves. As a judge, I didn't have a political platform. I was not a political person. Right and left, religious, secular, rich, poor, men, women, disabled and non-disabled, all were equal in my eyes. All are human beings created in the image of the Creator. I have protected the human dignity of each. I did not aspire to power. I did not seek to rule. I was aware of the chains that bind me as a judge and as the president of the Supreme Court. I have repeatedly emphasized that the rule of law is the rule of law and not the rule of judges. I am aware of the importance of the other branches of government, the legislative and the executive. I viewed my office as a mission. Judging is not a job. It is a way of life. I expressed those ideas, and with this I'll finish, in an opinion I wrote several years ago, considering whether extraordinary method of interrogation, torture in other words, may be used on terrorists in a ticking bomb situation. And here is what I wrote. We decided that no torture can be used. Deciding this application has been difficult for us. True, from the legal perspective, the road before us is smooth. We are, however, part of Israeli society. We know its problems and we live its history. We are not in an ivory tower. We live the life of this country. We are aware of the harsh reality of terrorism in which we are at times immersed. The fear that our ruling will prevent us from properly dealing with terrorists troubles us. But we are judges. We demand that other acts according to the law. This is also the demand that we make of ourselves. When we sit at trial, we stand on trial. Thank you.
Justice Barak has agreed to take questions if anyone has them. Dean Kagan will moderate this question and answer session. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Oscar Tan from the Philippines, from the LLM program. I was actually very heartened to hear the speech because it reminded me so much of our former Chief Justice, Hilario Davide,
whom I know very well.
Yeah, who has very similar thoughts on standing and judicial review. And in fact, one of his decisions gave standing to unborn generations who were trying to assert a transgenerational right to healthy environment. So that was something we had. But on the other hand, I was wondering if it's healthy for a developing country to give too much authority and discretion for judicial review to the Supreme Court, which we actually have right now in the Philippine Constitution, a very expanded power of judicial review, which has been used very expansively, to the point that they're now trying to scale back, and the Supreme Court is now being seen as too interventionist in even economic matters or social matters. One example I wrote about was that there was one relatively benign decision on the commander-in-chief powers of our president when he made a simple decision to deploy Marines to increase police visibility, and the Supreme Court decided to release a major decision invoking the commander-in-chief powers. A few years later, with a different president, this decision was used. It was invoked. They attempted to invoke it to justify what was termed as virtual martial law by another president. So I was wondering, if, given your speech, what healthy limits on such expansive judicial review, might be healthy for a developing country? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you mentioned President Davide. He was a great president. I knew him personally very well. I know that he retired also. I was supposed to give the keynote speech on his retirement in the Philippines, but I just couldn't make it. As to your question, of course, you asked me, is it a good idea to give too much powers to judges? And the answer is no, of course not. Too much power is wrong. But one should give the proper power to the judges. And then the question is, what does one mean in proper power? For me, judging is not an exercise in picking up what I want and leaving aside what I don't want. The non-justiciability doctrine, for example, is an American invention. One doesn't have it in Europe. European Constitutional Court adjudicate all the matters you mentioned and many, many others. The German Constitutional Court just decided several years ago, I think, if Germany can send its troops to Yugoslavia. Why not? Why can't the court make this kind of decision? Why can't an American court decide if the war in Vietnam or any other war is constitutional or not? The Japanese court can't do it because in the Japanese constitution it's written expressly. But if it's not written expressly, why can't those decisions be taken? But everything should be done in a balanced way, not to the extremes. And judges should not inject their own personal views. If under the Constitution there are special rules, as you mentioned, they should be recognized, whoever the president is, whoever the judges are. As I mentioned, we should act objectively. I express total disagreement to those views which are expressed by some law professors all over this country, saying, oh, we would like very much to have an expanded concept of judicial review if the judges are the Warren Court. But we will take the Constitution outside the court if it's not the Warren Court. That's not my view. My theory about judging is the same, whether it's the Warren Court or the Rehnquist Court or the Berger Court or the Richards Court. Doesn't matter. I may criticize what they decide, but I don't have parallel theories of the scope of judicial review depending on the question if I agree with the results or I don't agree with the results. So, democracy should not be ruled by judges. But judges should not let the other rule democracy without judicial review. So here you have the proper balance.
Yes. Could you go to the microphone? And others who have questions, perhaps it's best just to form a line at the microphone.
Nimr Sultani, I'm an SJD candidate. Now, my question is regarding the human rights violations in the occupied territories and the role of the Supreme Court in Israel in protecting these rights. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, the first citation was the citation from the entry into Israel and citizenship law. Is that correct?
The first question?
Citation in your speech was from the petition, from your opinion on the petition regarding the citizenship law.
Oh, yes, we have many petitions.
Now, let me remind the audience that in this decision, the Supreme Court decided to uphold the constitutionality of a law banning the marriage of an Israeli citizen from an Arab origin with a Palestinian in the occupied territories, which is a racist law according to any legal norm. Now, although you did have the minority opinion, that decision, the Supreme Court allowed this petition to be pending for 5 years, allowing the law and its subsequent harm to be in reality. And in another case, regarding the assassinations, or what is called the targeted assassinations, the Supreme Court also did not protect Palestinians from being daily assassinated by the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence. The demolition of houses on daily basis, thousands of houses are being demolished in Gaza and the West Bank, and the Supreme Court did not protect Palestinians on this regard. So, and may I also remind you by another decision that you took part of in the beginning of the 19th, when the Rabin government expelled 1,415 Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza to Lebanon without any due process. So, and many research by Israeli professors tell us that only less than 1% of the petitions of Palestinians from the occupied territories or human rights organizations in Israel and in Palestine regarding oppressive policies by the Israeli military, only less 1% of these petitions are accepted by the court in some form. And even those less than 1%, the court usually legitimizes the whole system of occupation. So my question in short is, how the Supreme Court protected, in your own view, the human rights under occupation?
Thank you. You raised many questions, many areas, and in order to, where are you? In order to answer you, I have, first of all, to put the, the record straight. So, as far as your first example was, the question was not can an Israeli and someone from the West Bank marry? Nothing to do with it. Of course they can marry, and they are married, and the marriage is valid. The question is the constitutional right to live as a couple in Israel. It's not even the question of constitutional right to live as a couple in the West Bank or Gaza. It's the question of has an Israeli spouse a constitutional right to bring his non-Israeli spouse to live in Israel? This was the question. And the court answered this question. I wrote the opinion. I was in the majority. Yes, there is a constitutional right. So I'm sorry to, well, I'm happy that I straightened it with you. We have not decided, and I don't know where have you taken this idea of 5 years. We have, because the statute itself is only for 1 year. And we decided that though the statute was run out of power, because it was just for 1 year, if it will be renewed, they have to recognize the right of the spouse, of the Israeli spouse, to reunion with the non-Israeli spouse in Israel, and that this constitutional right can be limited only if there is proof that there is a threat to the security of the state from this specific spouse that is wants to come, and not just that he is a member, that he belongs, that he is a citizen or resident of the West Bank and Gaza. As far as target assassination is concerned, the case is still open. Regrettably, I think I have to write it within the next 3 months. So I don't know where you came to the conclusion that we allowed it. We haven't decided it. Demolition of houses is a problem. We have according to my theory of standing and of justiciability, we have decided that some of the demolition of houses are legal, some are not legal. We applied there the principle of proportionality. We said that if someone is killed, you can destroy the house of the killer, but not of his parents, and not of someone who is not connected with it. I know the criticism even under those limited conditions, and it's a very complicated question. I do agree, and your criticism I accept. The expulsion of the 400 you mentioned, again, the description of the legal framework and of the decision was not accurate. On the contrary, we decided that the expulsion is not legal because there was no hearing. And the statute or the order that was published by the military commander that there's no need for hearing is illegal, as violation of the Geneva and the Hague Conventions. What we had thus decided that every one of those who were expelled may now come and get a hearing, and we provided a hearing on the border. So it's a totally different situation. As far as the less of 1%, First of all, it's not less than 1%, it's less than 5%. Second is, it is the exact percent whether the action is brought to our Supreme Court from the West Bank and Gaza, or the action is brought by an Israeli citizen, Jewish or Arab, in Israel itself. So it's just the same numbers. So you may say, okay, so you are wrong, you are bad both on the occupied territory scene and on the Israeli scene, both. I don't think you are right. I mean, this view is a right one. 5%, and we have, don't forget that we have every year something like 4,000 cases adjudicated. 5% is a reasonable number for petitions, or 95% is a reasonable number for petitions to be not being upheld. Take the American situation in which they get 6,000 and they pick up 80. We don't have this power. And so we have 4,000 petitions in public law. Clearly, most of them are just have no basis whatsoever and should be dismissed on the moment. And from those who are really true petitions that have bite, the percent is not 1% and the percent is not 5%, but we made research on it, it's something like 25%, which is a very high percent, and it is the same as far as for petitions from the West Bank and Gaza and petitions from Israel itself. In other words, I am the last one. Well, I'm not making any political stand on the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. As I mentioned, I'm not a politician. I haven't created it. I will not solve it. It's a political question to be solved. But the human rights of the local inhabitants, of the protected persons, should be protected. And we have exercised judicial review to protect their rights. Though they are our Guantanamo, if you want, or our Okinawa, if you want, or our Berlin, if you want, namely acts done outside Israel. In spite of that, our Supreme Court, one of the few in the world, I guess, has exercised judicial review against our military acting outside Israel in order to protect human rights. And we said that the constitution, so to called, under which all our military people have to act in the West Bank and Gaza are the international humanitarian laws. They are not allowed to deviate from them. And I wrote in one of the judgments, every Israeli soldier, from the chief of staff down, has in his kitbag, goes in its kitbag, with those basic principles of the international humanitarian law. And my court does its best to check it. We have every year something like 300 cases coming only from the West Bank and Gaza. I think in most cases we do well. In some cases we made mistakes. But let me assure you, the percent of our mistakes there is not different from the percent of our mistakes in Israel. Who doesn't make mistakes? Human judges, human beings do make mistakes, and I have my mistakes too. But the picture, as I see it, is different, very much different from the picture as you have presented it to us. But maybe another mistake of mine, you know.
Go ahead.
Hi. I have a question about justiciability and the Korematsu case. As you may recall, Justice Black wrote the majority opinion upholding the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Justice Murphy dissented, saying that it should have been overruled categorically. And Justice Jackson wrote an opinion basically saying that the Supreme Court should not have decided the question. So I guess my question is, which of those three would you have sided with? Is there any value in Justice Jackson's view of letting the political branches sort it out, even given the fundamental rights at stake? And also, if it could be shown that some substantial percentage of Japanese Americans, hypothetically, if this could be shown that, say, 10% of the people who were interned actually were involved somehow in sabotage or undermining the war effort, would that affect your conclusion? Thank you.
Well, I think it's quite clear that I would side with Murphy. It goes clearly not with Justice Black, and also not with Justice Jackson, because, as you summarized his views, I consider Korematsu of one of the disasters of the American Supreme Court. I wrote in this judgment another section, which I have not cited to you because it's a long judgment. I said, beware of Korematsu. Beware of Korematsu. Beware of Korematsu. Korematsu is a decision which is a black point on the blackboard of the development of American constitutional law. And it's a black point in the sense that it affects the curve. And it affects the curves of time of peace, and it affects the curve of time of war. And suddenly, for years and years, one wouldn't cite Korematsu. Suddenly, Korematsu is alive again. We judges all over the world should not follow Korematsu. And if there are 10% of Japanese who are very dangerous to the state, etc., an effort should be made to find those 2%, not to use a blank prohibition, but an individual check. And I do think that the whole issue is justiciable, of course, as you mentioned. Let me put it in another way. You know, here, let's say there is a military operation by Israeli forces or by American forces. And the question of the legality of this operation comes to the courts. And the courts say it's not justiciable. What will be the net result? A, the authorities will never know if it's legal or illegal within their own legal system. Secondly, those officials who have done what they have done may be put on trial in an international court. For example, the International Criminal Court. There suddenly it becomes justiciable. If it's something that judges should not work on, why does it apply only to us and not applies to them? And if it does not apply to the International Court, and it doesn't, and it shouldn't, it means that there will always be a judge somewhere to check the legality of those decisions. Isn't it more reasonable? Isn't it better that this check will be done by your quote-unquote natural judge, your own judge, than sending it to some international court? The whole concept of justiciability, I think, is one big bankruptcy.
President Barak, I'm wondering if I can take the prerogative of asking the last question. American courts really have been dealing with these issues of terrorism only for the last few years, much less experience than you have in Israel. As you watch what American courts are doing, I'm wondering whether you have any reflections, any thoughts on how they are doing, and what, if anything, they should be doing differently.
Well, I think they are moving on the right path. Too slowly. But I think they are moving on the right way. When I think it was Hamzi decision was given, if it's Hamzi, I met Justice O'Connor. And I congratulated her. I told her, I know how difficult it was for you to write this judgment. For me, it was very easy. I mean, for me, it is a non-case, basically. But you are on the right path, but too slowly, and too many obstacles in the way. Some of them are the product of history. Some of them are product of some, or maybe of federalism, I don't know. Some of them are products of some fear that if we will make this step, then something terribly will happen. And the answer is, go on this road, but make it much, much quicker. This is my reaction. to what the Americans are doing. I'm not an expert on the American technicalities. I know that there are 100 little problems that one has to solve, and you can fall in every little how do you say, pith on the road. But my feeling is, and I had discussions with many judges of the American Supreme Court on it, that they understand the role they are playing. And I think this is an important thing. The American Supreme Court is a very important Supreme Court. It is the Supreme Court who, first time in the history of human beings, exercised judicial review of constitutionality of statutes. That's America. It's your invention. And it's the court that protects some of the human rights in the most extensive way. First Amendment, free speech. We judges all over the world look and see what are the Americans doing. They themselves think that comparative law should not be used. All right, so if they don't want to look at what we are doing, that's fine. But still, we look at what they are doing. And I think they should realize that their audience is not just America, but it's the whole judiciary all over. And in many cases, they are rendering recently, they don't realize it at all. And you have a situation in which you have a very non-isolationist policy of America, and quite an isolationist policy of the court. And this tension creates many, many problems. And so in some cases, we judges of provincial courts, so to speak, all over the world, look to other courts. So we look to Canada, and we look to Germany, which has a first-class constitutional court. We look to South Africa, which has a brilliant constitutional court. And it's a pity. This is the motherland. This is the spécialité de la maison, is judicial review in America. And it's a pity. And my feeling is that what I am saying now suddenly penetrates, and that not all the judges, of some of the judges, suddenly realize what is at stake. At stake is not September 11, but at stake is the whole history, the whole future of American constitutional law, and the future of law in other countries. And so I think they are on the right, on the proper road, but it will take some time to reach it. So they are going slowly. We are going very quickly. But we will look behind and see, come, join us. And I'm sure they'll do. Be good judges.
President Barak, I think we've all seen in the last hour how it is that you earned this wonderful honor. I want to thank you and give the microphone back to Patricia Gruber.
Thank you, Justice Barak. Thank you, Dean Kagan. This concludes our program.